Welcome. It's such an honor to be here at the Soufan Center's Global Security Forum. I am Karen Greenberg, the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School and the editor-in-chief of the CNS Soufan Group Morning Brief. Our panel today is entitled From Local to Global, New Forms of Violent Extremism. Our plan is to discuss the current threats posed by violent extremism, how the threat is evolving in local, regional, and global perspective, and where the most pressing challenges lie in the days and months ahead. With me today to discuss this are two very special guests, each of whom provides leadership to today's counterterrorism efforts. First, let me introduce Michele Coninsx, who has had a distinguished career as a prosecutor, a law professor, and a counterterrorism practitioner and expert. She is currently the executive director of the UN's Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, or CTED, and president of Eurojust. Also with us today is Gilles de Kerchove, who has been the EU's counterterrorism coordinator since 2007, and before that helped bring Eurojust into being in his position as the director in the General Directorate of Justice and Home Affairs in the General Secretariat of the Council of the European Union. He also teaches law and is a prolific writer on topics such as European law, human rights, security, and counterterrorism. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
I started at the very beginning by getting a sense from each of you of where we stand in terms of the threat of violent extremism today. You both have been in the weeds and thinking about this and being proactive about countering violent extremism. Between the years before 9/11 and after 9/11, where are we? Are we in a place of managed threat? Are we in a place of heightened threat? How would you describe the landscape? Gilles, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I would generally explain that I see that the threat is still serious and has probably not significantly decreased since 9/11. But what has changed is we have reduced our vulnerability a lot. So if you define the risk as an equation with two elements, the threat and the vulnerabilities, that's okay. But the threat has changed, of course, over the years. The jihadist terrorism threat remains the most important one, but it has morphed. And as we've seen in Europe in the last 2-3 weeks, we don't have, and that's a good news, a terrorist attack conducted, directed by core Daesh from Syria and Iraq. They're no longer capable for doing that. It's more homegrown, as we say, people inspired by the ideology and committing low-tech attacks. I can develop that later. But we have seen step by step the rise of another forms of extreme, right-wing violent extremism, which we will discuss, I'm sure, which is a serious concern for some of our member states, not all of them. And the third source of threat, it's much less acute, let's be honest, but we may see the rise of new forms of extremism. And I see at least 2 or 3 possible development. And that was, it started a bit during the COVID crisis. The first is what I call technophobia, and I may develop that if you want in a way, a new form of possible extremism. If the crisis gets worse, that there is an increase in poverty, in unemployment and so on, we may see some sort of resurgence of left-wing, and eco-violence might develop in the near future as well. But obviously, the threat linked to Daesh and Al-Qaeda remains the main one, but in Europe, at least, it has morphed.
Michele, would you agree with this? Do you want to talk a little bit about how you see it, and particularly from the point of view of you talk a lot and have written some interesting things on technology and the use of the cyber environment and how that may have changed the threats we face. So how do you see it?
I totally do concur with what Gilles de Kerchove just explained to all of us. I see the threat as certainly a global, a serious threat which changes corpus, its shape, but which is there since certainly the last 2 decades. And I would like to look at it in a fourfold way. First and foremost, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Taliban is still a threat. They declined their capability, their operational terrorist capability for sure. Look at 2015, 2016, when ISIL was a very centralized core. Well, it changed its corpus, it changed its shape after the territorial losses in Iraq 2017, 2019 in Syria, and we see it now morphing into a more loose structure with a lot of affiliates. ISWAP, ISGAP, ISK, the Islamic State and the Greater Sahara, a few examples, ISIL linked. In Al-Qaeda, you have al-Baghdadi, but also there never has been a very structured network, but it's now certainly also active. It's all over the place as well, and together with the Taliban. So that threat is still there. It's sure linked to the impact of COVID-19. I will come back to this later. Second, the rise of extreme right-wing terrorism, as we label it right now. It can be labeled as basic and ethically motivated terrorism, but as we see it now, it is becoming more and more frequent. It's becoming more and more lethal, and the overall online presence is manifesting itself more and more in offline presence. Think about Christchurch, think about El Paso, think about Halle and Hanau, to mention a few of those terrorist attacks. Third, the foreign terrorist fighters, which in our latest report of the Secretary General presented in the Security Council in August, is referring to 10,000 foreign terrorist fighters still remaining in Iraq and in Syria. If you look at Afghanistan, South Asia, the numbers were around 2,000 and 2,000 foreign terrorist fighters. And they will have an intention to relocate or return, and that is posing a constant threat. All this combined with the impact of COVID-19, short, mid, long term in the conflict zones and the non-conflict zones, is a Molotov cocktail, which is leading to a lot of need for alertness and vigilance, and certainly not for complacence.
I want to talk a little bit about what's been in so much of the headlines, which is the right wing, the growth of the right wing extremist movements. And what I'm curious about to start with is how each of you sees the ideological component of this. What's the message? When we talk about, and further to that, is there an evolving message inside a jihadist framework as well? 9/11 was a long time ago. Bin Laden was killed a long time ago. The question is, has the message changed? And what are the messages of these two? And if you want to fill in on left-wing terrorism and incipient violence, you can talk about that as well. But how has the messaging itself, the content of it, changed? Gilles?
On the right-wing violent extremism, we had, in a way, 50 shades of gray, different type of messages, supremacist, and so on. But more and more, we see them converging and having at least one coherent ideology structured around the concept developed by the French writer Renaud Camus, the great replacement, that the white population will disappear, will be replaced by Arabs, by different people. And so I think this, in a way, bring a lot of different people who had sometimes a more nationalistic or agenda together. What I find quite interesting, if you look at the message and the ideology of both the right-wing violent extremism and on the other side, let's say Daesh and Al-Qaeda type of ideology, of course they have different agenda. Of course they stand in the opposite place of the spectrum, but in a way they have a lot in common in what is quite disturbing. Both are very racist. They against the Arabs, a lot of misogyny, a lot of homophobic discourse, a lot of anti-Semitism. But by the way, anti-Semitism is shared by the left wing, the right wing, and by jihadists. A sort of black and white vision of society, a taste for a clash of civilization type of approach. And so this is quite interesting. And what is interesting is to ask whether the two are feeding each other, if there is a sort of reciprocal radicalization. As to the message of Daesh or Al-Qaeda, I don't believe we've seen such a different message over the years. It remains a bit the same rhetoric.
Michele, I know you've given some thought to countering these threats as they evolve. And I'm just wondering what how you think about the right wing, countering right wing extremism differently than jihadist extremism, or do you see them in the same sort of counterterrorism toolbox? What's the same? What's different? How do you assess this?
We have, of course, seen that some extreme right-wing terrorist narratives magnify, exploit the ISIL and the Al-Qaeda narratives and vice versa. And that, of course, they also in some kind of cases shared their narratives. I call this a lines of opportunities. But the thing is that narratives, trying to narratives, and that is called reciprocal radicalization, is a little bit too simplistic. Both are two distinct issues. And radicalization is extremely complex, is also something that can not possibly be ascribed to one cause, to one driver. And so it is extremely important to have a tailored approach, not a one-size-fits-all approach, but a case-by-case approach for every single ISIL, Al-Qaeda affiliated or led terrorist activity narrative, and for extreme right-wing terrorists, whatever the shape is, be it white supremacists, bigotry, be it anti-Semitism, be it misogyny, all, and it's true what Gilles said, there is a lot of similarity. They of course play with narratives online, they misuse, abuse the fears and the anxiety and the grievances, and COVID-19 again is a very, very nice setting where there is already a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty, and where abusing, misusing that is of course reinforcing the messaging.
Right. I mean, one of the things that you've talked about in particular is both of you, but you in particular, is the crime terror nexus and the way, the ability to use the criminal justice system and criminal justice organizations and agencies to counter violent extremism. And so is what you're saying really an extension of that approach, which is this is how we have to think about it, really in terms of what's criminal and what isn't, rather than in terms of countering the ideology, or not?
I believe we have to address the ideological dimension. Is probably the part that we have addressed the least in our policy on both sides. On the jihadi side, there is a very distorted brand of Islam, which has many different impacts, both in terms of cohesion in our society, in terms of human rights. And in some cases, I don't suggest it's in all cases like this, it is a driver of radicalization. There is endless debate in Europe as to whether radical Islam plays a role in the process of radicalization or not, or there are other drivers. But this means that we have, and that's what we want to do in Europe. Minister of Interior met last week to prepare a meeting of the heads of state and government in response to the 3 or 4 important terrorist attack we've had in Europe in the last 3 weeks. How can we reduce the external financing of this ideological dimension? How can we reduce the spread online? And I hope we'll have time to address the issue on internet, because it's a very important one. And how do you reduce the problematic content that you might find in schools, notably in Europe? And so, yes, we have to address the ideological one, which I find quite interesting in what we have experienced during the COVID time, and especially on internet, which I had not seen before. It's a growing convergence between 3 types of content. And in Europe, we have developed 3 types of dialogue with the large internet platform. One on terrorism content, the classical one, be it jihadi one or right-wing one. Hate speech, xenophobic speech, anti-Semitism. And the first 2 are illegal. And the third one is disinformation. And disinformation, in a way, may have an impact on radicalization, both right-wing, and probably there are states trying to feed right-wing feelings by disinforming people, and jihadi ideology as well, because you may also try to divide our society and portray them as Islamophobic as well. And so that's quite interesting, this convergence between 3 types of speeches.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that and just ask you how adept are counter cyber people, experts, at figuring out what a disinformation campaign consists of, who's responsible for it. How progressed are we in terms of counterterrorism abilities? How does this stand?
As I've said, now we have addressed disinformation in Europe, at least. It was mainly as something developed by third states and not terrorist group. And that's why I speak of a convergence in a way. And we are now tackling the issue of algorithm amplification, which is a very serious problem. That in the most important platform, Facebook, YouTube, they have designed the algorithm in a way to amplify all this. If you look at QAnon, or if you were searching on internet for a vaccine or anti-vaccine, you had question on vaccine, you were pushed to see more and more YouTube videos on people who don't want to wear a mask. And then that would lead you to QAnon. And more of the same. So, and in fact, specialists in neuroscience know exactly how to design the algorithm to keep you as long as possible on the platform, because they know people like borderline content a lot more than boring, normal content. And so this algorithm amplification is a serious concern that we would like to address in the coming legislation, what we will call the Digital Service Act. So it's a mix of ideology and a boost on internet.
Michele Coninsx, let me ask you, I know you've thought about this, about the internet. Now, how do you see this? Do you see this as something that we're always going to have to manage, or something that experts can really get on top of and defeat those that are using it in this way? What do you think?
Well, this is a serious problem. This is a trans-border problem, and the internet is being overly used, and especially under COVID-19. We have seen that billions of students are making internet usage. We see that very vulnerable young people without any internet surveillance are being targeted by possible terrorist groups, or by violent extremist, extreme right-wing groups online, and the gaming sites, for instance. So we see that an already very vulnerable group making use, a huge usage of internet social media is being looked at, targeted, possibly targeted by people with terrorist intention or violent extremist intent. So that is part of the new reality. But we also have seen that because of COVID-19, because let's not forget the COVID-19 context we're in, more online usage, a little bit frustration of terrorism, violent extremism in the beginning, because as all of us, we were blocked, will not be able to travel. There was a travel stop. So they had to think about something else. And hence we have seen, be it in terrorist narrative, be it in violent extremist narrative, a huge increase of online presence. And that cannot be denied. And that online presence, of course, needs to be followed. We have an enormous variety of Security Council resolutions which are tackling that online presence, from 1624 to 2354 on counter-narratives to the ones you have referred to, 2462 on the countering of financing of terrorism, and then the nexus between organized crime and terrorism through 2482. And in all of these cases, we see that the fil rouge, the last two Security Council resolutions, the fil rouge is that a possible nexus. How do they continue to be alive and kicking online? How do they manage to have their financing guaranteed? More border management controls, so maybe they have to change and switch from the air and the land trafficking to the trafficking by the maritime ways. All these things have to be thoroughly looked at. One thing is for sure, the online presence. All kinds of trafficking online that can expand gradually, and also CFT guaranteed through those trafficking online. And hence, what we have been doing is underlining at the United Nations level, at the global level, the importance, the huge importance of not only looking at the classical partnerships, but the public-private partnerships. And give CT as an example of that. Also, the Tech Against Terrorism that was established by CTAT, the knowledge sharing platform to bring those communication service providers near to the problem, how to moderate content, how to delete, take down content, and it is already a very complex job when you're faced with terrorism-related offenses. What about violent extremism, extreme right-wing related content, where there is already a lot of discussion about terminology and differences from state to state. So yes, there is a lot to be done, and no reasons for complacence. And not later than last week, we had a whole event on how to bring terrorism, violent extremists to justice, because that is still the core objective, to have a deterrence, to honor the victims, to make sure that you have tailored and comprehensive prosecution, rehabilitation, reintegration strategies. Well, because of digital evidence and the non-accessibility or lack thereof, coupled with so-called battlefield evidence and the absolute need for international cooperation and coordination, all this is a little bit flawed, impacted by COVID-19, but is an integral part of successes in bringing people to justice. So there is a lot of reasons to step up public-private partnerships, to create clarity, to continue the criminal justice path, but to have a clear eye on all these movements in the online space, with the absolute overusage of internet, social media, and taking in, as Gilles rightfully said, so many new forms and new techniques which are really making us not sleep during nighttime.
I guess that leads me to a question, which is, for all of this counterterrorism thinking, 5-10 years ago, if we'd had this conversation, we would have been talking a lot about prevention rather than just deterrence and bringing to justice. So, you had started to talk a little bit about the schools, and, you know, reforming what goes on in the schools. But I even mean just broader than that. Are there efforts at prevention? Is that something we're thinking about, particularly as we have kind of a convergence between right-wing extremism and Islamist extremism in sort of form and substance? So how should we think about prevention today?
We are investing a lot on prevent. We have not given up. And I keep pushing the colleagues in Brussels to do more on in mobilizing what I call the soft policies: education, culture, because Daesh wanted to have a society in black and white with no culture. That's why they destroy antiquities and cultural goods, sports. And so there is a lot we can do to prevent. Often we should avoid the CT label, the counter-terrorism label, because that is counterproductive. I've pushed ideas like connecting young students in Europe with students in the Arab world, a sort of virtual Erasmus program. You would have a class in Molenbeek in Brussels having the same teacher with a class in Egypt. So very important, because in Europe, Erasmus program is probably the one which contribute the most to remove stereotypes. And so we need to bring people more together. We need to work to fight any forms of discrimination, any forms of hatred and racism against Arabs and Muslims. So promote integration, give more opportunities to the youth. So all this is as important as as you said, the kinetic response or the deterrence or the criminal. Of course, we need to improve all the tools of criminal justice. They've been working a lot on battlefield evidence, on digital evidence, and so on. But we need to have the whole spectrum. So I do confirm we are very much in it. The European Commission set up a quite interesting initiative called the Radicalization Aware Network, connecting more than 6,000 frontliners, practitioners, teachers, prison staff, people dealing, psychologists, just to identify the best practice. If we take only the question of disengagement program, frankly, it's one of the most difficult issues. How do you convince someone not to use violence to promote his or her ideas? And so we need to build on local experience and identify the best one and promote the best one. So yes, prevent is very critical. On this, there is the ideology is part of the prevent policy. For instance, it's a difficult debate in Europe. How do we want to develop, to create more diversity in the interpretation of Islam in Europe and not let one brand of Islam occupy the whole religious space? So this is one. And internet, at the end, is equally important. Media literacy. Just train and teach our kids just to have a critical thinking when they go on internet. It's so important, so that they're not too much influenced by QAnon and all other disinformation stuff that you find on internet.
Interesting. What about the UN?
Well, it's one of the core.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the core principles is to have in all the 193 member states a national counterterrorism strategy, and that's covering both the CVE, the countering violent extremism, and the countering of terrorism. And that requires at all stages a whole of society and a whole of government approach, whole of government with all the players. And that's not with the classical justice, interior, defense players, but with youth, women, finance, all the players. And if we go to a country in doing the CTC Security Council assessment visit, and we see that there is a huge coordination, that the National Counterterrorism Strategy do include the whole of society players. That means all layers of society, from the religious leaders to the CSO, the civil society organizations, to the academic world, youth, women, and so important, the gender dimension of the fight against terrorism and the countering of violent extremism, but also youth. And Gilles alluded to it. We see in a lot of countries that the majorities of societies are youth between 15 and 30 years old. We also see that some terrorist affiliate groups abuse those minorities or majorities in this case, shut down the schools, make sure that they don't have educations, put pressure on the teachers. And we have seen the recent attacks in South Africa, in the Lake Chad Basin countries, where the schools really were targeted, because terrorist and white extremist groups do know that if you touch on education, you create a whole level of youngsters without perspective, and you fuel radicalization in time to be. So it is extremely important that we have this gender and age-sensitive approach, a whole of society and a whole of government approach, and that we ensure that all the member states, not one or a few of them, have a national counterterrorism strategy. And it's an integral part of our assessment. It is an integral part of what we do in conjunction and in collaboration with OCT, the Office to Counterterrorism, for having capacity building and technical assistance to make sure that these national and both regional counterterrorism strategies are put in place. The appetite might be different, the gaps are being identified, but it's our task to identify these gaps in time and to find the right remedy again in time.
And just to follow up on that, do you get a feeling that this is really starting to catch on, that more and more countries are approaching it from a holistic perspective? Or is there a sense that there's a real uphill battle to sort of have people understand how important this holistic, whole of government, whole different levels of society and voices to address the issue?
I would leave to Michele the answer, because she's the one assessing the world. But I'm trying to push the EU institution to support third countries a lot in this direction, of course, because as Michele said, in too many places, the hard response prevail. And the show is driven by the spooks, by the security service, the hard guys, and not by the soft guys. And so we have, it's a long-term effort to convince government and to give more importance to, as we have said, education. As Michele said, if you take only Burkina Faso, you have thousands and thousands of kids out of school. And we know that these functions are not very at the core of the city response. So yes, we do support financially. The European Union is one of the largest donors in the world, program for gender equality, because we believe women are key in the process, as Michele said, education, media, train journalists to report and not just support the police or the security service. And I would say criminal justice as well, because in too many states, there are not enough convictions. In the Sahel region, for instance, you don't have enough convictions of people for terrorism or organized crime. So you never send a message that this is a crime. And this is another problem. Yes, but we're not there yet, I'm afraid. No.
Got it. I'm curious about something else we've been reading about a lot in the press these days is you'll find a new group, often a right-wing group these days. And then the next thing you know, there's a sense that even if it was in one state, in one country or one province, all of a sudden it seems to have an international dimension. Is this happening as regularly as we read about it? And how does that happen? That there's sort of a local group and then it becomes regionalized and then it becomes internationalized? Or do they all end up converging into the larger group? How's this functioning? How's this happening?
I don't believe there is a lot more connection between people through internet. I would, for the time being, for me, right-wing violent extremism remains something where it falls into violence done by lone actors. I think you cannot replicate the AQ type organization steering what people have to do. You have an increased connectivity between right-wing violent extremists. thanks to internet. But to say that groups are working to help each other, yes, there are groups. But I would not start with the groups. I would start with the internet and with the ideology more than the classical approach to fight against groups. But
that's really interesting, because that helps explain how you can be reading on the one hand about the killings of the recent headlines, the heads of Al-Qaeda, the emerging heads of Al-Qaeda being killed, and other terrorist leaders in recent months being killed. And yet at the same time, we keep hearing about this persistent terrorist threat. So again, that's a difference of kind, right, in terms of thinking what the threat is.
I was talking about the right wing, violent extremist movement.
Yeah, but I think. So does it cross over? Is my question. Is it pertinent to both or not?
For Daesh, as Michele said at the outset, they still rely on the franchises and affiliated groups. But sometimes I ask myself whether it's wise to lump them together so much, because a lot of these local groups, they've just pledged allegiance to Daesh for a very convenient reason. These are local groups with local grievances, and probably we do them a favor by looking at them as part of Daesh. We should probably address each and every one on the I wouldn't say on their merits, because they don't have merits, but on their special features.
Michele, do you see this as an extra challenge? Sort of, it's a way in which it's a fragmentation.
It is extremely challenging. As I said earlier, ISIL was known for its very centralized structure and core. They lost territories. They lost their leader. Their current leader is less communicative, and so we see that there is more like a loose network spread over different, very crucial regions: Middle East, Africa, from the Sahara, Greater Sahara, to the Sahel, to Lake Chad Basin, to East Africa, to South Africa, but also going to South Asia, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. And what I see is that we don't have this capability to direct high-level terrorist activity, but they inspire. So the online presence is absolutely there to recruit, to incite, to have propaganda, to fund their terrorism. Think about what happened last year in April, the Sunday Easter attacks in Sri Lanka, claimed by ISIL at the end, but it was an inspired terrorist attack, which led to the killing of more than 200 persons in 8 different places. If you look at violent extremism, extreme right wing, you see that indeed for extreme right wing, the reason why we devoted a trend alert at 2 occasions this year, June and July, is because it's expanding gradually, and not in one state or in one region only, but from North America to Europe to the Ukraine. We see that it is like in Australasia a huge problem. So, and when it's becoming a threat to international peace and security, we discuss, debate on it in the Security Council. That's what we have been doing last year in the closed session, but also this year and recently in a GRN, the Global Research Network. It's our network established 5 years ago with more than 100 academic institutes and research centers, and everybody flagged it as a growing threat to international peace and security, with international links, international support networks, but also, as I have alluded to, in our assessments, we saw, for instance, 2018, 2019, especially in those I have led, 31 visits, 10 member states flagged the huge concern of extreme right wing in different regions. So it cannot be a coincidence again and any longer. That, coupled to our research based on open sources, our assessments, and the work of the research centers, is really a very clear sign this is something we have to take very seriously. So I think that at both sides, the online, that is the link, I think the online increase is overwhelming, and it doesn't stick at the online presence. It is going further. The financing, the incitement, the recruitment is ongoing. But even more, the impact of COVID-19, let's not forget that it's still having its impact. Short term, we have seen that it had more impact in the conflict zones than in the non-conflict zones. And we're only talking about the short-term vision. And indeed, we have seen in a lot of African states huge terrorists, be it in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Cameroon, in Mozambique, to mention only a few of them, and not to mention Nigeria and Mali. So yes, there is like a sort of an oil stain, and we have to use all our gravitas to stop this oil stain, which might go into all kind of directions.
You know, you've both mentioned COVID, both in, you know, passing and more specifically like you just have. And I'm just wondering, so thinking ahead to a vaccine and to sort of getting through the COVID era and being able to manage whatever the fallout is, do you see this as something that will take the pressure off of increased radicalization? Or do you see it as something that may have really changed the landscape in terms of promoting a new layer and energy to terrorism? How do each of you see that? Michele, do you want to go first?
Well, sure. We have indeed made a brief on the impact of COVID-19, and that's for the daylight in June. We're now on the process to preparing our second edition, which will cover the midterm impact of COVID-19, and then another one on the long-term impact. One of the long-term impacts is this a possible focus because of the financial and economic impact of COVID-19 from the security priority to the safety priority, or from the global attention to the pure national attention. Whereas we all know that for both the combat against COVID-19, against violent extremism and terrorism, you need international cooperation, coordination, you need information exchange, you need to handle all these issues at local, national, regional, and global level. It's not and or, it's and. But there might be a reshift of the focus from the global to the national level. So the contrary impact. Also what we call the shrinking of the civic space of civil society organizations. We talked about this in our whole society approach, and how vital civil society organizations are also in a criminal justice perspective. Prosecution, rehabilitation, reintegration, or rehabilitation in or in an off prison setting, and the reintegration that asks for a contribution of the civil society organization, of the NGOs. That might, for budgetary, financial reasons, that space might be shrinking. And then we also obviously see that the fear, the anxieties of being misused, malused through disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and are fueling the radicalization and violent extremism. So this is what we're working on with, of course, we see in our daily dialogue with the 193 member states differences from region to region, but that is something we have to have a clear eye on. The problem, security problem, will not go away. It will extend, it will become more complex. Gilles has very well alluded to the ICT aspect of it and the different forms of violent extremism. That will not go away, and terrorists also had time to reflect during the non-travel period. So again, that's my main message: no reasons for complacence.
Gilles, what about you? How do you see the COVID era as changing the terrorism landscape and the counterterrorism landscape?
In Europe, in the short term, we have not seen an impact of COVID in the short term. In the rest of the world, I tend to believe that most of what we have seen was just something which had been launched before. So in Afghanistan or even in the Sahel, I don't believe that the surge in the number of terrorist attacks is a direct consequence of COVID. But in the medium and long term, there will be an economic, social impact. There is an increase in poverty. I think the World Bank mentioned recently that 150 million people will fall into poverty. That will inevitably have an impact on terrorism in a way. And on top of it, the budget which have been put into health and other priorities will be probably at the expense of security. So one of the risks is that on top of the economic and sanitary crisis, we have a security crisis. But what I've said before, where I see some development is the surge in right-wing violent extremist content and conspiracy theory on internet, first. Second, my point on the convergence of content, which is a serious concern. Probably new forms of extremism, and I had no time to develop my point on technophobia, but it's, I think, something we'll see more. Four, cyber crime has really boomed during COVID, and that may give more ideas to terrorist group. We have not something like cyber terrorism for the time being, but that can come in the future. And finally, you don't need a PhD to understand that a virus can disrupt society so much. People have seen the impact of COVID on our society. So it may give additional, re-energize the idea to use the virus for terrorism purposes, bioterrorism. So terrorist organizations cannot do it for the time being. They cannot process a virus and spread the virus on a large scale. But the techs, the disruptive techs, synthetic bio, to process a virus in a cloud lab, it's something which is nearly on the shelf and a lot more accessible to everyone. So we have to be prepared for that as well. So I don't know if COVID is a game changer, but it has consequences and we have to address them one by one.
So it sounds like, COVID is an accelerator in some ways.
Indeed.
Well, you've both brought up some very interesting questions and answers. I would love to come back again and talk about technophobia. But basically, the takeaway is that the world of terrorism is even more complex these days, has many, many different forms, and that trying to stay ahead of it is going to take all of our efforts. So thank you both. Thank you,
Thank
Gilles.
you, Karen.
Thank you, Michele, Coninsx. And
You're welcome, Karen.
Bye-bye.